The tattered survivors who emerged from the Gedrosian desert were no longer an army. They were a funeral procession of specters. Each soldier carried on his shoulders the weight of the merciless sun, the memory of thirst that cracked their lips, and the image of comrades swallowed by the sands. Upon entering the prosperous province of Carmania, they were received as ghosts returned from the underworld. The journey that was supposed to be the ultimate proof of Alexander's divinity had become a monument to his fallibility. Alexander, who had marched on foot with his men, sharing every torment, now needed to restore not only the physical strength of his army, but also its shattered soul. He organized a week of festivities, a Dionysian celebration of relief and survival. Wine flowed in rivers to wash away the memory of thirst, and banquets were served to satisfy the hunger that had nearly consumed them. It was a desperate attempt to wash away trauma with excess, but the scars, both on Alexander and his men, were too deep to be healed by mere revelry. Upon returning to the heart of his empire, Alexander found a realm in disarray. His long absence in the east had been an invitation to corruption and rebellion. Satraps he had left in power, Persian and Macedonian alike, had ruled as tyrants, growing rich illicitly and abusing their authority. News of their crimes reached Alexander like a cascade of betrayals. His response was swift and merciless. Several satraps were summarily executed, a purge intended to restore order and remind everyone that the king's eyes, even from afar, saw everything. The clemency that had marked his early conquests gave way to a dark suspicion and a cruel justice. It was in Susa, one of the great Persian capitals, that Alexander unveiled his boldest plan for the future of his empire. He did not intend to rule as a Macedonian conqueror over a subjugated people. His vision was one of fusion, the creation of a new ruling elite, a blended people uniting the blood of Macedonia and Persia, forging a cultural bridge between West and East. To seal this union, he orchestrated the most extraordinary event of his life, the mass weddings at Susa. In a 5-day ceremony of unprecedented opulence, Alexander married 2 Persian princesses, Statira, the eldest daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, daughter of the former king Artaxerxes III. It was an act of profound political symbolism, linking his lineage to that of his predecessors. But he did not stop there. He ordered 80 of his closest generals and officers, including his dearest friend Hephaestion, who married Dripidis, Statiria's sister, to marry women of the highest Persian nobility. And, to seal the pact at the heart of his army, he granted generous dowries to 10,000 of his soldiers, so that they could marry Persian women. The ceremony followed Persian customs, a grand spectacle celebrating the new era Alexander envisioned. For him, it was the pinnacle of his policy of fusion, the foundation of a multicultural unified empire. For many of his men, however, it was the greatest of insults. The Macedonian veterans who had crossed deserts and bled on countless battlefields to defeat the Persians were now being forced to marry the women of their enemies. They saw the gesture as a dilution of their identity, proof that their king was abandoning the Macedonian way of life for his new Oriental customs. The resentment, already simmering since the marriage to Roxana, now began to boil dangerously. The tension erupted at Opis, a city on the banks of the Tigris River. There, Alexander gathered his army for an announcement he believed would be a reward. He declared that the veterans, the wounded men, and those who had been in the army the longest would be discharged and sent back to Macedonia with honors and a generous pension. He expected shouts of joy, but was met with a hostile silence, followed by a roar of fury. For the soldiers, this was not a reward. It was a dismissal. After the weddings in Susa and the integration of 30,000 young Persians, the Epigonoi, trained and armed in the Macedonian way, into his army, They saw the discharge as confirmation of their worst fears. They were being replaced by barbarians. The cry that echoed through the camp was a direct challenge. It was the gravest insubordination Alexander had ever faced. Rage overtook him. Without hesitation, he leaped from his platform, pointed to the 13 loudest leaders of the mutiny, and ordered his guards to arrest them. They were dragged away and executed on the spot. The shock of this action silenced the crowd. Then, with order restored by force, Alexander climbed back onto the platform and delivered the most powerful speech of his life. His voice, at first filled with anger, gave way to an emotional, memory-laden address. He did not chastise them as a distant king. He spoke to them as a brother in arms. He began with his father, Philip, who had found them as poor shepherds dressed in animal skins and turned them into soldiers of an invincible army. He listed every victory they had shared, every river they had crossed, every mountain they had climbed together. "I have shared every danger with you," he proclaimed. "My wounds speak for me." He reminded them of the riches they had plundered, the glory they had won. He contrasted his own modesty with their opulence, reminding them that while they had treasures to send home, he had only debts, incurred to guarantee their honor. "Go home," he said, "and tell how you abandoned your king to the enemies he defeated for you." With that, he withdrew to his palace and, as he had at the Hephaestion, locked himself away for 3 days, refusing to see any of his Macedonian companions. This time, though, his strategy was different. He began organizing his new Persian units, giving them Macedonian names and positions of honor. He was building a barbarian army to replace his own. The news spread through the camp, and the Macedonians' fury turned to panic and remorse. The prospect of a future without Alexander, their leader and source of glory, was unbearable. They rushed to the palace gates, threw their weapons to the ground, and begged to be seen, weeping and pleading for forgiveness. Alexander finally emerged, his own eyes brimming with tears. Seeing his men's genuine remorse, his hardness melted away. The king and his soldiers wept together in a moment of collective catharsis. To seal the reconciliation, Alexander organized a great banquet. 9,000 men, Macedonians and Persians, sat together, with Alexander and his companions at the center. They drank from the same cup and prayed to the same gods for a future of harmony and a united empire. The mutiny at Opus had tested the limits of loyalty and identity, but for now, the fracture seemed healed. Peace, however, would be tragically brief. After the events at Opus, the court moved to Ecbatana for the autumn. There, amid festivals and games, tragedy struck Alexander in a way that no spear or army ever could. Hephaestion, his childhood friend, his most trusted general, the other half of his soul, fell ill. The illness began as a fever. Hephaestion's doctor prescribed treatment and rest, but Hephaestion, feeling better, ignored the orders and attended a banquet, where he ate boiled chicken and drank a large amount of chilled wine. His condition then worsened catastrophically. When word reached Alexander, who was watching the games, he rushed to his friend's side, but arrived too late. Hephaestion was dead. Alexander's reaction was not that of a king, but of a man whose soul had been torn from him. An animalistic cry of pain echoed through the palace. He threw himself on Hephaestion's body, refusing to move for a day and a night, weeping and talking to his friend as if he could still hear. The mourning that followed was as grand in scale as his ambition. He ordered public mourning throughout the empire. The sacred flame in every temple was extinguished, a Persian custom reserved for the death of the great king. He ordered the manes of every horse and mule to be shorn. Music was banned. In a fit of rage and pain, he had the unfortunate doctor, Glaucius, crucified for negligence. He ordered the local temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, to be razed to the ground for failing to save his lifelong companion. But that was just the beginning. He sent a message to the oracle of Siwa, the one that had declared him a god's son, asking if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The answer was more modest. Hephaestion could be honored as a divine hero. Alexander then began planning the most spectacular funeral the world had ever seen. He ordered the construction of a funeral pyre in Babylon, a colossal 5-story structure adorned with ship prows, golden statues, and purple tapestries, whose cost, according to some sources, was 12,000 talents, a fortune that could have funded several military campaigns. Alexander, just as Achilles had done at the funeral of his beloved companion Patroclus, cut a lock of his own hair and threw it onto Hephaestion's pyre. Hephaestion's death was the blow from which Alexander would never recover. He lost not only a friend, but the only person with whom he could truly be himself, the mirror of his soul, the man who, as he had once told the Persian queen mother, was also Alexander. Grief consumed him, turning into a dark depression and feverish restlessness. He led a winter campaign against the Kasayan tribes in the mountains, a brutal distraction he called a sacrificial offering to Hephaestion. The year 324 BCE, which had begun with the promise of a new empire forged in Susa, ended in Opus, with a reconciled but fractured army, and in Ecbatana, with the heart of its king broken. Alexander, the conqueror of the world, was now terribly alone, haunted by the ghosts of his enemies, his friends, and above all, by the shadow of the man he once was. The end was closer than he could have imagined.